Hello and welcome to Mr. Valentin's YouTube video for Christmas Carol, review of staves 1 through 3. And today we're going to take a look at literary terms. We're going to take a look at a bunch of characters, kind of go through characters, make sure we understand who they are, and just general review of literary terms and information. So let's take a look. New this time, I put in an information box. So I'll put the information in the box and then bring it down to other areas on the screen. So important literary terms, of course, is the exposition. Remember, the exposition is the introduction to the setting and the characters. And that's everything in our story of Stave 1. The inciting incident is the turning point of the story. The complication is the events leading to the climax. The climax is the highest point of action. The denouement or denouement are the events leading to the resolution. And the resolution is where events conclude. Some other important literary terms: simile, which is a comparison using like or as. Personification, giving lifelike qualities to non-living or non-human things. Kennings, a two-word poetic renaming of someone or something. The last literary term is tone, which you've heard before. All right, establishes the mood. It also, the tone tells us the speaker's intention and their attitude towards the subject. So those are some important literary terms, among others, to keep in mind. So we're going to begin in the exposition and take a look at some important characters. So when our story begins, the very first thing that the story says is Marley was dead to begin with, which is really important. That Marley's dead. It's repeated something like 7 times in the first 3 or 4 pages of the story. All right. It says Marley was dead to begin with. There was no doubt whatever about that. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. All right. So when you see that, what literary term do you think of? Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. And of course, we know if we have a comparison that uses like or as, It's a simile. All right. What's unique about our story is we have an omniscient narrator, this narrator who knows all, and he is a character within the story. He comments on events and tells us how we should feel. Which is important and makes the story very unique. So keep that in mind. The first character we're introduced to, as we see here, is Ebenezer Scrooge. He's associated with ice imagery. They describe everything around him as cold and frightening. Nobody likes him. And he doesn't like anybody. We find out in our story that Marley was Scrooge's only friend, and vice versa. And Scrooge, and presumably Marley, hates Christmas and everything associated with it. And so that's our introduction to Scrooge. The first character we're introduced to is initially only known as the clerk. Later, we find out his name is Bob Cratchit. And we find out that he works for Scrooge. He himself is very happy, but his circumstances that surround him are sad. But more on that later. All right. So the most important thing is we find out he works for Scrooge. Everything about him is described kind of just really depressing, really pathetic. All right. He doesn't have a coat, we find out. He wears a comforter. He only has one piece of coal in his fireplace. So we get all these little details, but they're all really kind of just depressing. So keep that in mind when you have Bob Cratchit. So a lot of the pictures always show him as a happy person, right? Kind of dapper and intelligent looking, all right, as does this picture on the right show us. We're introduced to Scrooge's nephew, whose name turns out to be Fred. We find out later on. And Scrooge's nephew is also this really kind of happy guy. He presents the antithesis of Scrooge. Antithesis kind of means the opposite. All right, presents the opposite, or the juxtaposition, which also is, I guess, just a fancy word for opposite. When he comes into Scrooge's office, we see him as, again, very happy. All right, he invites Scrooge to a party on Christmas Day. Scrooge ignores him completely, wants nothing to do with him. So Scrooge purposely pushes his nephew away, but his nephew, because he's a nice guy, right, does not care and wishes him a happy Christmas. Now, in this little scene where we're introduced to Fred, we're also introduced to these charity workers. And these charity workers ask for donations. And Scrooge denies the donation. Which I think is important. The charity workers ask for, quote, liberality, which means like money, just so to speak. So I think that's important. And so their scene is really interesting. They say in the book, under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, returned to the gentleman, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it's a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. All right, and that's an important little moment when it says, when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. And notice in the text, all right, that this is capitalized, both the word want and the word abundance. So if they're giving lifelike qualities to non-living or inanimate objects, of course, we have personification. So as Scrooge talks to these charity workers, all right, Scrooge says he refuses to donate to them, that they should go into workhouses, and the charity workers are offended that Scrooge says that they should go work in these workhouses or go to prisons. They say many can't go there and many would rather die. And Scrooge has this famous line, which is, if they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. All right, so Scrooge is ignorant to the poor's needs. All right. Which, again, very important. And Scrooge's nephew is kind of the opposite, this person who wants to give. All right, so we see that antithesis of the two. Now, Scrooge isn't entirely the most miserable human being at the beginning of our story. Right before the shop closes, Scrooge gives Bob the day off. Which is important. We kind of see Scrooge as somewhat of a human being. When Scrooge walks home, it's kind of this eerie, creepy thing, right? One of the things that happens in our story is Scrooge gets to his house and looks in his knocker and sees Marley's face. For just a second, but he sees it. If you see something that's not really there, Alright, a false image. What literary term is it? And of course, we know that literary term is an illusion. Falsified image. So, Scrooge goes home. They describe his dinner as just kind of sad. Alright, this melancholy dinner, they say. And it's just this kind of depressing images we get over and over again. And so Scrooge is alone, and then a bell rings. And then all the bells in his house start ringing. And then he hears the sound of dragging chains. And it turns out these dragging chains are the ghost of Jacob Marley. Which is important. So Jacob Marley comes and haunts him. They give this kind of terrifying image of Marley. Right? They have all these chains kind of on him with like lock boxes and safes. His jaw is unhinged. Right? He's often described as having like a wrapper on him around his cheeks, and he unravels it and his jaw just kind of drops open. So that's kind of why I put this picture up. And so Jacob Marley talks to Scrooge, and Scrooge at first calls him a bit of undigested meat. He's very critical of Jacob Marley, but Marley kind of howls, he screams, and Scrooge is terrified by this. And this is where we have the inciting incident of the story, which is Marley tells Scrooge that he'll be visited by 3 ghosts. And Scrooge says, "No thanks." But Marley doesn't care. Alright, and so that kind of concludes the first stave. Alright, we're introduced to all these characters. Yeah. Alright, so after we find out he's going to be visited by the 3 ghosts, Jacob Marley vanishes into the air. Alright, he has a dirge, alright, which is a somber song or lament that expresses grief or sorrow or mourning. So there's a good vocabulary / literary term right there. Alright, and so that's the end of the exposition and the inciting incident. And so we begin the complication. The complication, alright, is all about here we go. Is all about the ghost of Christmas past and Scrooge's past. And it's not just one past, it's many pasts that he has. So, this is a terrible picture of the ghost of Christmas past, because no one really knows how to accurately describe it. It does have the hat, which is important. It kind of looks like it's changing shapes. Alright, but if we take a look at the description of the ghost, they say, "It was a strange figure. It was like a child, yet not like a child is like an old man." Alright, so it looks like a child and also like an old man. The description continues. Its hair, which hung around its neck and down its back, was white as if with age. So it had long white hair. Its arms were long and muscular. It's described as wearing a dress with flowers on it, and a giant beaming light shooting out of its head. You get all these really absurd kind of images. A sparkling belt is mentioned at one point. And then, of course, the cap. And so the ghost takes him into his past, where we're introduced to a whole new slew of characters and kind of find out, all right, the first thing we find out is that as a child, Scrooge was very lonely. He had imaginary friends. And he enjoyed studying over hanging out with people. And so, yeah, the images are sad. We see him make up imaginary characters like Ali Baba and Robin Crusoe. And these characters are all from famous books and famous historical figures and whatnot. So if we're referring to famous characters from other times, what literary term do we have? And of course, the literary term is allusion, which is, remember, a reference to literary or historical person, place, or thing. So let's take a look at a couple of the characters we meet. In the past, alright, the first important character we're sort of introduced to is Fan. Fan is Scrooge's sister. Fred's mother. Remember, Fred is Scrooge's nephew. And we find out that she died a young woman. They don't explain how young she is, but she must be very young when she dies, like maybe early 20s, because it appears, at the very least, that Fred never knew his mother. So, Scrooge's life is surrounded by sadness and loneliness. Which I think is important. The other character we're introduced to is Belle. Belle is Scrooge's ex-fiancée. And we later find out that their relationship ended because Scrooge's #1 priority was priority, that's supposed to say priority was money. So that ended his relationship, and it ended around Christmas. And so Scrooge views Christmas as a lonely time. But then we're introduced to a really important character whose name is Fezziwig. Fezziwig was Scrooge's boss. Scrooge was an apprentice under Fezziwig. And Scrooge was also an apprentice with a guy named Dick Wilkins. And so we're introduced to all these kind of characters, but the important thing is that Fezziwig treats his employees with respect. And for the first time, Scrooge sees that a little money can make a lot of people happy. So we see Fezziwig throw a party. We meet Mrs. Fezziwig, who turns out to be a lot of fun as well. And they dance and they have a good time. And it's at this time Scrooge is, again, realizing that being this awful person isn't getting him anywhere. And so we start to see a change in Scrooge immediately in the complication. He leaves the past, he gets home, and that ends stave 2. We enter stave 3, which is the climax, which is all about the present, all about Christmas Day. And we are introduced to the ghost of Christmas Present. And the ghost of Christmas Present is kind of like this Santa Claus figure. He has a green robe, as you see by the picture. He holds this torch. He transforms Scrooge's house to be covered in all sorts of greenery. And of course, covered in food. He wears holly on his head. He has bare feet, described as a giant. With curly red hair, curly red or dark brown hair. And he's this larger than life, kind of forgetful individual. And so he brings Scrooge around the shops on Christmas Day. And he sees how, despite people being poor, people are happy. And so the ghost brings him to various locations. He leaves the past. One of the first locations he brings them to is Bob Cratchit's house. And it's this kind of sad, depressing, not very nice house. It's described as only having 4 rooms. which if you think of 4 rooms, they didn't say 4 bedrooms, they said 4 rooms. 4 rooms could be as simple as a bathroom, bedroom, living room, and kitchen. If you ever saw Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, that kind of beginning room that they have with all the grandparents, it's just this very tiny little house. So we find out that not only is the house tiny, but a lot of people live there. At the very least, all right, there's Bob, Mrs. Cratchit, Peter, their son, Belinda, 2 younger ones, and Tiny Tim. There's also Martha, but Martha appears to live on her own, like she's an older sibling. Or she works a lot and isn't home. It's never made exactly clear. And so their dinner is kind of a goose, which is a cheap dinner. Not nowadays. Back then, goose was considered this lesser meat. And Bob isn't home initially, but when Bob comes home, he comes home, all right, with Tiny Tim. And so I have this picture of Tiny Tim on the side here. He's just this kind of very small, very meek child. And it seems his time is fleeting. That he won't be alive for much longer if something isn't done to take care of his health. And so Scrooge asks the ghost of Christmas Present, well, what's to be done with this child? And the ghost comments that he thinks the child will die. And so that's Bob's house. The other house they go to is Fred's house. And this scene is full of parties and games and people making a lot of jokes. What's sad about this scene, and this is where Scrooge, I think, really realizes he's messed up, is that, Fred cares for Scrooge. But Scrooge is so miserable that even in this scene, Fred makes fun of him. They play the game Yes, No, which is like 20 questions. And the clue is that, let's see, let me pull it up. So the game was called Yes and No, and it says in the text, so Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and to test must find out what, and he could only answer the questions with yes or no. So everyone kind of rapid fire throws questions at him. Is he an animal? And he says yes. Right? A live animal? Rather a disagreeable animal? A savage animal? An animal that growled and grunted sometimes and talked sometimes and lived in London? And the answers are all yes, yes, yes. Or walked about the streets and wasn't made a show of and wasn't led by anybody and didn't live in a menagerie and was never killed in a market and was not a horse or an ass or a cow or a bull or a tiger or a dog or a pig. And then it turns out that the answer to all of these terrible things, after calling him a bear and whatnot, is that this horrible creature is Scrooge. Sorry if you hear this grumbling in the background. There's a snowplow going by because it's blizzarding outside. So, I digress. And so after that, it's kind of, you see, I like this picture that I have of this performance where Scrooge is kind of this sad, the ghost of Christmas present is watching, alright, and they're kind of just making fun of him. And Scrooge becomes this sad, burdened person. At the end of the scene, Scrooge takes a look at the spirit, and the spirit ages. The spirit's life is really short. It turns out it's only 1 year, or possibly even only 1 day, and that every year there's a new ghost of Christmas present. And Scrooge notices something underneath his robe, and it turns out to be 2 children. And the children's names is Ignorance and Want. The boy is Ignorance. The girl is Want. And Scrooge looks at these children and sees how sad they are. And so Scrooge asks what's to be done. And the ghost replies, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" Insinuating the same thing that Scrooge said about poor people before, that if they'd rather die, then they better go do it. But sometimes people forget, alright, that poor people involves children and other things, and that's something that Scrooge seems to have forgotten. Alright. And so the child boy has doomed written on his forehead. And so these children, without any help, are doomed, which is important. And so that ends the climax of the story, just kind of on this sad, depressing note. And the steam starts rolling in, this fog, and so begins the denouement, which is on my next video. So, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, rewatch, review literary terms, and hopefully you enjoyed. Thanks for listening.